And I would like to thank the Center for Consciousness Studies, NIMHANS, and your group specially for having me in this program today. So yesterday I was just listening on the internet to an interview with Ned Block, Professor Ned Block. He is professor of philosophy. He is probably one of the leading philosophers of mind in the world today. And he is here in NYU, New York University. And NYU has, I think, one of the best analytic philosophy departments in the whole world. So he was saying in this interview that what is the role of philosophy? This is a group, the group I'm talking to specifically right now is a group of neuroscientists. So what is the role of philosophy? Because there is one view in consciousness studies today that it is a field for neuroscientists. And as we keep on doing more and more of the neuroscience, we will get the answers we are seeking. There is nothing that philosophy, ancient or modern, can actually contribute here. Patricia Churchland, in a paper which I read, she said that these are the central questions. There are some central questions in the field of consciousness studies, and the answer to them, some of it we have, a lot of it we do not have. But the way forward is not through philosophical thinking. And she was talking about the Western philosophy of mind there. But it is the way forward is to keep on doing neuroscience and more neuroscience, and we will get the answer. And I've come across this point of view again and again. For example, I was speaking with Massimo. He's a biologist and a professor of philosophy at City University of New York a couple of years ago. And he said that, look, I am convinced. Sorry. He said that, look, I'm convinced that consciousness is a phenomenon of living brains. Living brains, it produces consciousness. We do not know how it produces consciousness. What is exactly the link between our first person experience, which we call consciousness, and the functionings in the brain, which we are beginning to study and map. But there is a link, and it is, we will prove it. Give us 10, 20, 30 years. So this is called promissory materialism. So promissory materialism means I will be able to explain consciousness in terms of a material entity, for example, the living brain, but not yet, in time. And the example he gave was that look at the question of life. 100 years back, it was a common thing to say that science can never explain life or understand life. But today we understand life, say, down to almost a to the molecular level, in fact. The processes which we together call life are pretty well understood. So, and this is another, I mean, the same argument that just like life, we have been able to understand through more in-depth understanding of the molecular processes in living bodies. Similarly, we will be able to explain and understand consciousness in the near future by a more deeper understanding of what's going on in the brain. Ned Block also, yesterday in that interview I heard, he used the same argument, the life comparison with consciousness. Later on in this talk, I will explain why that example does not hold. It's a category mistake, I think. But the question asked to Ned Block was, what can philosophy contribute, the philosophy of mind? And he said, yes, the way forward is with neuroscience, but philosophy is important because it can help clarify and elucidate certain concepts. When we are talking about consciousness, what exactly is it that we are talking about? What is the understanding of the term consciousness? These things can be clarified by philosophy. So I think that's a good place to start. Exactly what are we doing in a field which is dominated by neuroscience? What can philosophy contribute to it, whether Western or modern or ancient, Western or Indian? So this is the thing. It can help in, and I really think that's important. There are certain concepts which will come up in the course of my talk. It will come up. I will show how Advaita Vedanta, Sankhya can contribute enormously important concepts to the study of consciousness. Has philosophy in recent times been interested in consciousness? Yes. Oxford University Press, they released this thing, the 5 great unsolved questions in philosophy. If you Google it, you will find 5 great unsolved questions in philosophy, Oxford University Press. Though when I read that, I felt that, are there any solved questions in philosophy? I think in philosophy, almost no question is ever solved. It goes on and on in newer and newer forms. But 5 great unsolved questions. And if you're wondering, what are those 5 questions? You will notice, I'll tell you what those 5 questions are, supposed to be the great unsolved questions in philosophy. You will notice 4 of them are connected with consciousness. It's very interesting. The Oxford University Press, that article, it says the 5 great questions are who am I? Are what is free will? Third is, can we know anything at all? The question of epistemological skepticism. What is death? Not in the medical sense, in the sense of self. So what is death? And the final question was, what is justice? But that may not be directly related to consciousness. But the first 4 are directly related to consciousness. The question of what am I or who am I? The question of free will, the question of knowledge, and the question of death, psychological death. So consciousness is actually, in that sense, central to philosophical thinking. Then why do we not stick to modern philosophy of mind? I'll tell you where the problem is and where Indian philosophy and ancient philosophy comes in. 2 years ago, I got this opportunity to study the philosophy of mind at Harvard University. And I just took this introductory course. I wanted to read all the literature, the main papers in the field in the recent times. What I noticed was, if you step back a little and look at all the papers that are given in any introductory course on the philosophy of mind, that Descartes, nearly 300 years ago, was probably the last person to say anything interesting, anything significant in the whole field. The field has stalled. The field of philosophy of mind is stuck. It is not making progress. What do I mean by that? Descartes, nearly 300 years ago, he made this famous, this Descartesian division between body and mind, the so-called mind-body problem, the so-called dualism of mind and body. He showed how clearly that the two are distinct, they're two distinct realities, and one cannot be reduced to the other. Of course, that leads to the problem of interaction, but that's a different thing. We'll see that later. Now, the rest of the field, the philosophy of mind in the last, especially last century, in 20th century, if you see, neatly it falls into 2 kinds of papers. I mean, all that we studied in that course at Harvard 2 years ago, all the papers can be neatly divided into 2 groups. One group saying that mind, and they are using mind and consciousness interchangeably. So mind or consciousness is something that can be reduced and has to be reduced back to the body. It is nothing but the brain, or nothing but language. It's a problem born of language. So the Oxford ordinary language philosophers in the 1950s, 60s, they tried to reduce the whole problem of mind into a linguistic problem. Or it is just like machine states, or something, nothing but X. The Y, X is nothing but Y. One philosopher called it nothing buttery. Nothing buttery means consciousness is nothing but brain, and brain is nothing but living matter. Matter is nothing but particles, atoms. Atoms are nothing but subatomic particles, which are nothing but quarks, which are nothing but superstrings. So there's nothing buttery. This reducing this whole consciousness or mind to something physical. And the other group of papers was saying, no, you cannot do that actually. It's showing that every attempt to reduce consciousness to, say, brain states or to neuronal activity, that attempt fails. There is a jump in the argument somewhere. So the entire field, what I'm trying to say is, if you look at a collection of readings in the philosophy of mind today in any university, you will see basically there's 2 kinds of papers. One is arguing that it can be reduced, consciousness mind can be reduced to brain, other one saying that it cannot be reduced, and that's where they are stuck. This is where I think Indian philosophy has a lot to contribute. Why and how, we will see today. The whole point of the talk is that. Evan Thompson, who's a philosopher at the University of British Columbia, he's written this book, Waking, Dreaming, Being. And in that he says, consciousness studies is not a new field. It's actually a very ancient field. And consciousness studies started with this most ancient texts called the Upanishads. And he goes on, Evan Thompson, he goes on to say that the Upanishads are so important in the history of human thought that instead of, dividing history into BC and AD, he says, which is basically a very ethnic, parochial way of dividing history. He says, if you look at the history of human thought, this is so crucial, Upanishads, we should divide history into before Upanishad and after Upanishad. It's so important these Upanishads are. So what is this Upanishadic thought, and how can it contribute to the modern quest for understanding consciousness? That is basically what I'm going to talk about. So this is the background of the presentation which is going to follow. Consciousness, first of all, the first point I want to make is consciousness is very, very important, tremendously so. Christoph Koch, who is the chief scientist for the Paul Allen Brain Institute, so some time back, he was giving a talk at the Harvard bookstore, but this was online. This was during the COVID time, so I heard it online. He was saying that consciousness is the most important thing. How so? So he said that suppose you give me $1 billion and say that you will not be conscious, you can continue to be living. You will be a living body on life support maybe, and you will be a billionaire, but you will not be conscious. Will you accept it? And he said, of course not. None of us will accept it. Consciousness is the central thing for us. Without consciousness, we are not there. So I and consciousness are basically the same thing. This, I think, look, it's important because it's coming from someone who is a neuroscientist and fully immersed in the Western tradition. He is saying consciousness is most important to us from our perspective. And I and consciousness basically are the same thing. If you say consciousness is not there, it's tantamount to saying I am not there then. This consciousness being the most important thing, this is one point I want to emphasize here. Why I want to emphasize this is it seems obvious to it, but still, I myself heard Ned Block, Professor Ned Block here in NYU, one day asking after a particular conference, just rhetorically, he was asking, why is the question of consciousness important at all? His point was, there are so many things going on in the body. So suppose there is one process in the liver or in the kidney which we don't understand. Well, all right. One day some postgraduate researcher will get a grant and research it and find out why that process is happening. And that's it. Why is it so important? Like that, one more process is going on in the brain and we are calling it consciousness. We don't understand it now. Maybe 50 years later, we will understand it. Why is it so important? The answer is it's very, very important because it is central to ourselves that I am consciousness. Without consciousness, nothing for me from my perspective. Consciousness is most important from our perspective. I think that's almost a trivial point. Why? It's a subtle point though. Our perspective and consciousness are basically the same thing. The very fact that we have a perspective from my point of view, from my experience, in my view, my point of view, my experience, all of this is made possible because I'm conscious. Without that, no perspective. Without that, no first-person experience. Without that, no self. Now, I'll just mention one more important finding or one more important area, the hard problem of consciousness, which gives us a launching pad into what we're going to talk about soon. David Chalmers, who is also here in the NYU Mind Brain Consciousness Unit. So David Chalmers, he coined the term hard problem of consciousness several years back. And we know basically what it is, what he means. He divides the whole field into so-called easy problems, so-called because as much more than any of us, the neuroscientists who are sitting here, they know it's not an easy problem. But easy in the sense that there are ways of investigating, there are ways of approaching this problem. By studying the brain processes, we can map it with conscious experience. So whatever happens, for example, if there is a pain, what is happening at the neurological level? Today we can study that, and the consciousness experts, neuroscientists are studying it. So this is one side, one field. This is basically what is going on in the field now. But David Chalmers, his contribution was, he says that how is it that purely physical processes like the neurons firing in the brain, how is it that they are transformed into this vivid first-person experience of life? I see color, I hear sound, I can think, I can remember, I can desire, I can love, I can hate, I can understand. And all these are experiences within me. This first-person living experience, to make it even more clear, now we have a range of smart machines. We have AI. Very powerful computers equipped with sensors. In a certain sense, they can sense, they can see, they can sense sound, they can interact with the environment, they can take decisions. They obviously have enormously powerful memories, much more than us. They are much faster, except one thing. These machines and the computers also, they do not have this first-person experience, which is the essence of consciousness. You will say, how do you know that? You just ask the people who are making these machines. Ask Google or IBM engineers and all. And I've talked to some of them, and none of them will ever say that we have programmed our machines to be conscious. None of them ever claim that even the most powerful computer that we have got today, the most capable AI that we have got today, is actually conscious, is having an inner experience. No. So you can duplicate all or replicate all of these so-called conscious experiences like seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking, but without the inner first-person experience. This inner first-person experience is contributed by consciousness, and how it's linked to brain, that is David Chalmers calls it the hard problem of consciousness. Now we'll see, so this is the background, and we'll see how Advaita Vedanta and Sankhya, what do they have to contribute here? What is the perspective that they have taken? So in ancient India, the project was a very practical project. How do you overcome suffering? And from the perspective of Vedanta or Sankhya, the idea was that if we know what we truly are, then we will be able to overcome suffering. Self-knowledge leads to overcoming suffering. So this is why they were interested in consciousness at all. The idea was, if we understand ourselves, we'll be able to overcome suffering, we'll attain fulfillment. That was the project. And it had many names: moksha, nirvana, kaivalya, and so on. Now, the moment they started investigating the self, ourselves, they found that our self and consciousness are inextricably linked. So when they became interested in the self, in Atma, they also became interested in consciousness, because they found self and consciousness go together. Now, the perspective that the process I will take up now is derived from the Upanishads and post-Upanishadic texts in the tradition of Shankaracharya. And we'll see two models emerging there. So the rest of the talk, I will dive into the actual procedures for studying consciousness in Vedanta and Sankhya, and then we'll see what it can contribute to modern consciousness studies. This procedure, let me point out something interesting. It is not a faith-based procedure. The moment we talk about somebody dressed in Gerua, religion, so immediately people think, oh, they are going to ask us to believe in something. The beauty of Advaita Vedanta or Sankhya or many of these Buddhist approaches to consciousness, they are not dependent on belief. In fact, you're not supposed to believe in it, you're supposed to understand it. So that's an important point to note. The second is, this whole approach we will see now, the whole approach we will see is rational and experiential. It is perfectly understandable in a logical way, and it's also based on experience. Even here, when we say based on experience, somebody may object. I know what you mean. By experience, you mean some kind of mystical experience. But then the whole question arises, is mystical experience, should it be accepted as experience also? So it's a different question. But the beauty, again, the beauty of the Vedantic approach is that it does not actually talk about a mystical experience. At least it begins with our common day-to-day experience and proceeds from there. So a rational inquiry based on our daily experience. That is the power of the Vedantic approach. It naturally appeals to a rational or scientific mind. How does it work? So I think I've built up enough advertisement. So now it's time to deliver the goods. And say, give us an example. How does this inquiry go about, this so-called rational experiential inquiry into consciousness, and what great insight can it give us, which will be useful to us today? So here we go. There are many such procedures in the Upanishads for studying the self as consciousness. One procedure, which I like very much, I will talk about it now. And if we have time, I'll bring up 2 or 3 other procedures. One procedure is this inquiry into the seer and the seen. This is called Drigdrishya Viveka. The seer means the knower. The seen means that is known. And the process is that you start off by noticing that the seer and the seen, drashta and drishya, the knower and the known, the subject and the object, are 2 different entities. Later on, we will abandon this, but right now we will start with the simple operating procedure that the knower and the known are 2 distinct entities. What we will do is we will look at our experience and go step by step by following our experience. It's a phenomenological approach. It's a first-person approach. Here also, let me point out one thing. The approach of neuroscience, because it's a modern Western scientific approach, is always like a third-person approach. So we have to study X. So I will study that thing called X, which is natural. It's perfectly all right when it works, when it is for objects of study. But consciousness is not an object. Consciousness is the subject. So when you're going to make the subject into an object, that becomes problematic. See, from a Vedantic perspective, what the problem is, the moment a consciousness studies expert, a neuroscientist says, octopuses are interesting for these reasons, and by studying octopus, we will understand consciousness better. The immediate objection is, from a Vedantic perspective, consciousness is directly available to you in your own experience. Ignoring that, why are you jumping to take a third-person view of an octopus? All that may be very interesting, but first, you take a look at your own experience. From a scientific perspective, there is an objection to this studying the first-person experience. In fact, I asked Professor Dr. Christoph Koch that what do you make of David Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness and studying it from the first-person perspective? He said he rejected the idea because he said you cannot do science that way. And he has a point. The whole scientific procedure, because it is always studying objects, it has been designed to study object and keep the subject out of the ambit of the study. But you see immediately what problem it leads to when the subject itself is the thing which you are studying. So the subject and object are 2 different entities. Drashta and Drishya, 2 different entities. I am taking a verse from the Drigdrishya Viveka, which was written in the south of India, in fact, near where you are sitting, in the Vijayanagar kingdoms 700 years ago, where Vidyaranya Swami. The first verse is so powerful. Rupam drishyam lochanam drik, tad drishyam drik tu manasam, drishyadhi vrittaya sakshi, drigeva natu drishyate. Now, this verse is so profound and it's a treasure house of insights. It starts in a very simple way, in a very naive way. It goes in 4 steps. Step 1. Remember, what are we looking for? We're trying to understand consciousness in itself. So step 1. The eyes are the seer and the forms are seen. What does that mean? Notice that everything that I see, all different colors and shapes, so many colors, so many shapes, all of them are seen by the same pair of eyes. The eyes and the colors that they see, shapes that they see, they are two different entities, and that's very clear. They're different entities, physically different. I am seeing this notebook with the eyes in the notebook are different. Not only that, a variety of shapes and colors are seen by the same pair of eyes. The seer is one, and the seen are many. Another insight is the seer is unchanging relatively, the eyes are unchanging, but what it sees is continuously changing. The seen are continuously changing, and the seer is relatively unchanging. Another insight is the seer. If you just put them together, the seer and the seen are different. The seer is one, and the seen are many, and the seer is unchanging, and the seen are continuously changing. So these are the basic insights we have got. Now you go a little deeper. Consider the eyes themselves. The eyes now become the seen in the sense not physically seen. We are experiencing the eyes. The eyes are open, I'm aware of it. The eyes are closed, I'm aware of it. The eyes are seeing well, I'm aware of that. I need glasses, I am aware of that. So the mind now becomes the seer, and the eyes are the seen. Mind in the seer in the sense that the mind knows the eyes. We are aware of the eyes. The mind is that which knows, and the eyes are the known. Again, notice the mind and the eyes are different. We can clearly see mind, whatever it is, it's different from the organs called the eyes. Not just the eyes, all the sense organs, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. The mind is something different from them and is aware of them. They are not aware of it. So very interestingly, I am aware of the eyes closing and opening of the eyes, but these organs called the eyes are not aware of the mind. The mind in itself is aware of this variety of senses and sensory inputs. So seer is one, the seen are many. And the seer is relatively unchanging, the seen are continuously changing. At one time I could see very well, then I needed glasses, and both are noticed by the same mind. You may say the mind also is changing. We're having a series of thoughts and feelings and emotions. But yes, the mind is changing into more mind, thoughts into more thoughts. But the seen, the sense organs are of various types and are changing in various different ways. Again, the same insights. Seer and seen are different. The seer is one, the seen are many. The seer is unchanging, and the seen are continuously changing. Go a little deeper. The mind itself, thoughts, feelings, emotions, ideas, they are all, we are aware of them. When I'm happy, I'm aware that I'm happy. It's a direct first-person experience. When I'm in pain, I'm aware that I'm in pain. It's a direct first-person experience. So the mind, all the contents of the mind, all thoughts, feelings, emotions, memories, sense of ego, all of these things are something that are known. In some sense, they are seen. And I, or the awareness, we are aware of the mind, of the contents of the mind. So drishyadhivrittaya, all the movements, modifications of the mind are also seen in that sense. And there is something, because the seer and seen are different, therefore that which is aware of the mind must be different from the mind. What shall we call it? Vidyaranya chooses to call it Sakshi, witness. It's just awareness, awareness of the contents of the mind. Now, the awareness itself is different from the mind. This is a tremendous insight. We will see that how important this is. Awareness or consciousness is different from the mind. It is aware of the mind, because seer and seen are different. So the consciousness is different from the mind. Awareness is one. The contents of the mind are many. So many different types of thoughts, feelings, perceptions, emotions, ideas. Awareness is unchanging. The thoughts, feelings, emotions in the mind are continuously changing. This seer is one, seer is unchanging, the seer is different from the seen. The seen are continuously changing, and they are many, a variety. So this Sakshi, it is, what if you ask, what is its nature? If there is such a thing as a Sakshi, its nature is awareness. And it illumines all of our first-person experiences. This is the basic idea of consciousness in Vedanta, Sankhya, many of the Indian systems of philosophy, not all though. What does it do? It gives us first-person experience. So this is an answer to the question that David Chalmers has posed in The Hard Problem of Consciousness. How do physical processes give rise to this first-person experiences? And the answer is physical processes do not give rise to this first-person experiences. And the first-person experience is because of awareness itself. Now, if you can ever prove that physical processes gives rise to awareness, I don't see how you can, then only you'll be able to explain how physical processes like brain processes give rise to first-person experiences. But that jump is too much. I remember seeing this cartoon of some, I think, PhD student explaining some mathematics, and his guide is standing there in the cartoon. So in the cartoon, there are 5 steps, and the PhD student has written on the board 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. First, second, and third steps full of mathematics. So much big equations are written. 5th step, even mathematics, more mathematics is there. 4th step, only it is written a miracle. And the guide is telling the student, I think you have to work on the 4th step. I heard, I think it was Christoph Koch himself who said, see, this is the basic problem in the whole field of consciousness studies, as far as the hard problem is concerned, not in the so-called easy problems, the correlational problems, but in the hard problem of consciousness, it is this miracle step. How does, he's giving a biblical reference, how does the water of physical processes become converted into the wine of consciousness? Where is this jump that we are unable to explain? That is because from a Vedantic perspective, this is one of the first and very important concepts here, precisely one of the first and very important concepts that Vedanta or Sankhya can contribute to modern philosophy of mind, and through that to modern consciousness studies. It is what you are studying, awareness, consciousness, is in itself not an object. It is not an objective process. Objective processes can be reduced to other objective processes, but because awareness or consciousness itself is not an objective process, the pure subject is not an objective process, it cannot be reduced to physical processes. Now you see my objection to that, using the example of life, when Massimo or Ned Block uses the example of life, that one day we did not understand life, now we understand life. Similarly, we don't understand consciousness now, how brain can produce consciousness. We will be able to understand in 30, 40 years how brain can produce consciousness. We'll be able to reduce consciousness to brain. From a Vedantic perspective, you see, immediately we see they're making a category error. From a Vedantic perspective or Sankhyan perspective, in fact, all the Indian philosophies, they all regard even life, prana, as an objective process. So if you have been able to explain prana or life in terms of more fundamental objective material processes, very good. From a Sankhyan or Vedantic perspective, there was no objection in the first place. You can explain material processes in terms of other more fundamental material processes. But consciousness in itself, as consciousness, as awareness, is not a material process, is not an object. So you cannot reduce this into more fundamental objective or material processes. So the moment you say that just like life, we understood it in terms of cellular processes, we will understand consciousness in terms of neuronal processes. No, from a Vedantic perspective, you are making a category mistake. You are jumping from the subject to the object side of it. So this is the thing. Someone as great as David Hume, a brilliant philosopher, he says that this self, so-called self, I observe my inner processes, inner thoughts. It's a stream of thoughts and emotions and ideas, perceptions. Where is this self? I do not see anything called a self. So he comes to the conclusion there is no such fundamental thing as the self. Vedanta says, in fact, Panchadashi, same Vidyaranya, in his famous text Panchadashi, he says, the self is not perceived, consciousness is not perceived because it's not an object, not because it does not exist. I'll repeat that. This is such a simple but a profound observation. The self or consciousness is not observed, is not perceived or perceived or observed because not because it does not exist, but because it is not an object. That means reality can be of two kinds: an objective, material, natural reality, and consciousness itself. So consciousness and material reality. Again, not a new idea. It is as old as Sankhya itself. Sankhya says there are ultimately two realities in this universe: consciousness and nature, Prakriti, Purusha and Prakriti. And Purusha is not reducible to Prakriti. Consciousness is not reducible to material reality. All these thousands of years later, if you hear David Chalmers, he is now propounding something called panpsychism. It's an old idea, but he's revived it in modern times. He's saying that probably we cannot reduce consciousness to matter, and therefore we must accept a rather crazy idea that consciousness itself may be a fundamental reality. Just as we have matter, energy, time, space, consciousness itself may be a ubiquitous reality in this universe. And this is what he calls panpsychism. Consciousness is a fundamental, all-pervasive reality, which becomes evident in things like living brains and nervous systems. And coming from a different direction, Tonini's this integrated information theory, I think, that I don't understand it much. It sounds very complicated. But one thing it postulates is that consciousness is all pervasive. It's present in some form or the other, in a very basal level maybe, but everywhere, including, he says, even in fundamental particles of nature or even in space or whatever, and becomes obvious in living matter. So this was already an ancient idea, that because consciousness cannot be reduced to matter, you must postulate that consciousness exists independently of material processes, non-objective. Now, Drigdrishya Viveka goes further. How can we study consciousness itself? Here is the problem which Christoph Koch, that's why Christoph Koch says we cannot do science in this way. Drigdrishya Vivek says, Drigeva natu drishyate. Consciousness never becomes an object. Obviously, because if consciousness itself becomes an object, it's an object to whom or to what? It is always the subject which illumines the presence of all objects. Now, does this mean we cannot study consciousness? It's not an object? No, it just means we have to revise our understanding of what it means by studying something. I actually pointed out that I had to write a paper about modern philosophy of mind and ancient Indian philosophies at Harvard 2 years back. So there I pointed out there can be another way of studying it, and which is there for last 3,000-4,000 years. Sankhyans, Advaitins, Buddhists, Jainas have been doing it. What else have they been doing except studying consciousness? So there is this other way of studying it. For example, you cannot objectify consciousness, and yet it has a certain nature. We call it swaprakasha, self-luminous. It goes as far back as the Upanishads. Katha Upanishad says, Tameva bhantam anubhati sarvam, tasya bhasa sarvamidam vibhati. That shining, everything else shines. By its light, everything here is lit up. It's like the eyes. By the eyes, I can see everything. Whatever I see is seen through the eyes. But the eyes themselves are not seen. The eyes cannot see themselves. You might say I can see it in a mirror. I can see your own eyes in a computer. But that's a reflection of your eyes. That's a picture of your eyes. The way the eyes see directly everything, that way the eyes cannot directly see themselves. And yet, how do I know that I've got eyes? And the answer will be that because I can see. I can see everything, and that's the proof that not only these things are there, my eyes are also there and functioning. That's because I can see. Similarly, what is the proof of consciousness that there is such a thing? Every first-person experience is the proof of consciousness, because you see, you smell, you hear, you taste, you think, you talk. All of these first-person internal experiences we are having is proving that that I am consciousness itself. This self-luminous nature of consciousness. So the consciousness, although it's not an object of study, one must not go away disappointed thinking that, oh, we cannot study consciousness. Then you can. So One more point I would like to make here is that consciousness, mind, and brain, from a Vedantic or Sankhyan perspective, are three different entities. So mind and brain, that our physical body and the mind, are objective processes according to Vedanta. How do you define an objective process? Anything that consciousness is aware of is an object. I'll repeat that. Anything that you are aware of will be an object. Now, the body, we are aware of it, so it's an object. You can study the brain also, it's an object. But to all of us, our own thoughts, feelings, emotions, ideas, we are aware of them. We are directly aware of our own thoughts, feelings, emotions, and ideas. Therefore, they are all objects. So from a Vedantic perspective or Sankhyan perspective, the thoughts, feelings, emotions, ideas, the mind and the brain, because both are objects, it should be possible to find some linkage between them. From a Vedantic or Sankhyan cosmology, the mind is a kind of subtle matter and the body is physical matter or gross matter. So what is this subtle matter? This is an object of further investigation later on. But the point I want to make here is brain science, from a Vedantic perspective, what can it do? It can actually go very deep and also find out something about the mind itself. But it cannot access consciousness directly. It can access consciousness by its interaction with the mind. In that sense, yes. There is this very well-known physicist here in Princeton, in Institute of Advanced Studies, string theorist. Forget his name right now. Somebody asked him, so about consciousness, what do you think, and brain science? And he said, I think as we go along in brain science, we'll discover much more about the brain in itself, but we will not be able to understand how the brain produces consciousness. That, I think, was a very interesting insight. Of course, he's not a neuroscientist, but he's a physicist. But very interesting insight, which basically matches the Sankhyan or Vedantic perspective. So here we have, first of all, what do we have so far? Consciousness is most important from our perspective. Second, very important, is that consciousness is not an object or a material process. Consciousness or awareness is an independent reality, pure subject, not to be reduced to material or objective processes. Now we shall go on to the two more points I want to share with you. We shall now move from what is a dualistic position. Descartes' position was dualistic, mind and body. And the Sankhyan position, which we have arrived at right now, is also dualistic. Consciousness and everything else that is not consciousness. In Sanskrit, chit, jada. Purusha, prakriti. So consciousness is aware of the objective universe and it interacts with the objective universe through a living body mind. Now the same problem which Descartes faced, that how does this mind and body interact? If mind and body are totally different, what is the point of interaction? How do they obviously they're interacting. We are a mind-body system. So this is the problem which any dualism will have. See, even modern science, in a certain sense, it is a monism. It is a material monism. It tries to reduce everything to material processes. Even something like brain, consciousness, mind, it will try to reduce it. Consciousness is somehow it is brain, brain is somehow a living body is somehow organic matter, and matter is nothing but these particles, all the way down to maybe superstrings and so on. So it's a kind of material monism. But Sankhya is a dualism, just like Descartes' dualism. If you have two entirely different kinds of reality, the consciousness of Sankhya, the Purusha, or even David Chalmers' modern panpsychist consciousness, how does it interact with matter? At what point? The problem is the point at which they interact, will it be matter or consciousness? For example, Descartes tried to solve the problem by saying, mind interacts with the body in the pineal gland. That doesn't work because pineal gland is clearly a part of the body. So how is mind interacting with the body there? It's not an answer to the question. Similar problem arises in Sankhya. This consciousness you're talking about, non-objective, pure consciousness, awareness, Purusha, how does it interact with Prakriti, with matter, with body, with brain, even with the mind? How does it interact? So we move from here to a monistic theory of consciousness, diametrically opposite. It will sound a lot like the scientific reductionism, but they're diametrically opposite. Modern science tries to reduce everything to a material basis. And the monistic theory we are going towards is just the opposite. It will try to reduce even matter to consciousness. So 2 steps we will take, and then I will conclude. This consciousness, which Sankhya talks about, not the body, not the mind, the witness of body and mind, the drig, the seer. How many are there, if you ask? Sankhya will say, as many of us, as many living beings there are, they are all separate consciousnesses. So how many Purushas? Innumerable Purushas interacting with material nature. Now Vedanta asks, why do you say consciousness is many? Why do you say consciousness is many? Vedanta holds that all consciousness is actually one consciousness. Now, Sankhya raises objections to this. We are different consciousnesses. Why? So the objections are like, for example, if one person is awake, everyone should be awake if you are all one consciousness. It's only because we are different consciousnesses, one is sleeping, one is awake. But Vedanta will answer that question by saying that by your own logic, this objection is defeated. You are saying awake, waking, dreaming, sleep. These are not activities of consciousness. These are activities of the mind. The mind is awake. The mind falls asleep. The mind is dreaming, and consciousness just reveals it. Again, remember, this answer is very clear. The moment we are well centered in the idea that consciousness is not an object. Whatever is aware, that is consciousness, and what you are aware of, that's an object. Are you aware of the mind? Yes. And are we aware of waking, dreaming, deep sleep? Yes. Then in that case, these are processes of the mind, not consciousness. Minds are many. In one place, the mind is asleep. In another body, the mind is awake. And therefore, here you are waking, you are dreaming. Consciousness is not different in either case. Another objection from Sankhya would be, well, what about knowledge? If we are one consciousness, then what my teacher knows, I should also know. But no, that doesn't work. I have to gather that knowledge myself, and that the teacher's knowledge is not my knowledge. So clearly my teacher's consciousness and my consciousness are different. Again, you can see this is not a good objection, because immediately the Vedantin will say, by your own logic, your knowledge is in the mind. So the mind of the teacher has got the knowledge, the mind of the student does not have the knowledge, and the mind of the student gathers that knowledge. Consciousness reveals. It is the same consciousness. Consciousness is not the one which has knowledge or is ignorant. So why would you differentiate consciousness on that basis? Another objection. Now you're basically beginning to get the idea. What are the objections? And all the objections, Vedanta will say it's a problem of the mind or the body, not of consciousness. So why are you differentiating consciousness on that basis? Life and death. Sankhya says, well, how will you distinguish living and dead? One person is living, one person is dead. If all consciousness was one, then when one person died, everybody should die. If one person is living, everybody should be living. But what kind of objection is this? Vedanta will say, because life and death are pertaining to the body. One body is alive and one body dies. How does that make consciousness different? So all the differences that Sankhya puts up to show that consciousnesses are different is related to either the mind or the body, both of which are objective processes. Why? Because they are objects to consciousness. In fact, the eminent philosopher, Professor Arindam Chakravarti, who was here 2 years ago, but now he is back in Hawaii, he puts it very beautifully and humorously. What is an object? Anything that objects to consciousness is an object. So imagine consciousness as a field of awareness, and then you become aware of certain things: form, sight, touch, thoughts. These are all objecting to the field of consciousness, and so they become delineated. We become aware of them. So that's a nice way of putting it. Object is anything that objects to consciousness. So Vedanta makes the claim, you have no grounds for saying consciousness is many. Bodies are many, minds are many, objects are many, but consciousness is one. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says to Arjuna in 13th chapter, in all bodies, there are many of these knowers, this knowing consciousness. In all bodies, there's a knowing consciousness, the knower of the body. And then he makes the stunning claim, in all bodies, the knower, the consciousness is one consciousness, and I am that one consciousness in all bodies. Kshetragyam chapi mam vidhi sarva kshetreshu bharata. I alone am the knower of the field in all the fields, O Arjuna. This is the meaning. This is a very radical claim. All consciousness is one consciousness. This, by the way, just as an, again, what use does it have to the modern study of consciousness? David Chalmers, he is saying that one big problem with the panpsychist approach is the problem of division. How does consciousness divide itself to be one consciousness in each body? And then, so how do you divide consciousness? Now, from this perspective, the Advaitic perspective, you see, there's no need to divide consciousness. It is one consciousness. It shines in and through different minds and appears to be different. Gita again, avibhaktam cha bhuteshu vibhaktam iva cha sthitam. Undivided in all beings, it appears as if divided because of many minds and bodies. Now, last step. We still have time. So the last step, we have now, let's do a little stock taking. What have we done now? We have first of all seen that consciousness is not an object or an objective process. It is the pure subject which is aware of, which illumines and reveals all objective processes. Step one. Step two is that there are not many consciousnesses. There is only one consciousness, which appears to be many because of functioning or shining through multiple minds. An example is given, like a big pot. You have a big clay pot, and there is a lamp inside it, and there are many holes in the pot. So from outside, in the dark, you will see many rays of light coming out, thin rays of light coming out. It's like one consciousness, but radiating through so many individuals, it seems to be many consciousnesses. Now we have got one consciousness and the entire material universe. The Sankhyan perspective was many consciousnesses and the entire material universe. Now we have united all those many consciousnesses into one consciousness and the entire material universe. The last step is to reduce the material universe back into consciousness. The object into the subject. And this will solve the problem of interaction. You remember, the problem of interaction is two entirely different entities. How do they interact? This is the whole problem which Descartes thought about and he could not find an answer to. And no dualism will be able to find an answer to. So we'll go into a monism of consciousness, which is Advaita Vedanta. What Advaita Vedanta asks now is, fine, we have consciousness and we have the objective universe, matter, body, even mind. This is objective universe. How do they interact? If they're entirely different, there's no point of interaction. Just like Descartes' pineal gland, where is this point of interaction? Where does consciousness come in touch with its object? If it comes in touch, in connection, somehow, is that point of connection, is it consciousness or matter? Is it subject or object? You cannot solve it that way. So what Vedanta does is, it says that all of this material universe is actually an appearance in consciousness. It appears to consciousness, step one. Step two is it appears in consciousness. And step three is it is nothing other than consciousness. Consciousness appearing as its own object. The good example would be dreams. So in dreams, we forget that we are sleeping on the bed and we have this virtual world of dreams. We meet people, we interact with them, there are events going on. We are ourselves there in our own dream. We can see ourselves there as this body. But when we wake up, we realize there was nothing there except the dreaming mind. This mind, the dreamer's mind, by itself produced subject, object, produced a world, and it was experiencing it. So the whole thing was, including people and activities and buildings and earth and sky, whatever you saw in the dream was actually mind. Similarly, it's not mind here, but external universe, physical body, mind, they are all appearances in consciousness. And then consciousness experiences its own appearances. In ancient Indian philosophy, there were multiple perspectives on this. I'll give you a quick sketch of these perspectives and then we'll conclude. One perspective was perspectives on what? What is the relationship between subject and object? What's the relationship between consciousness and matter? One perspective was consciousness emerges out of matter, which in principle is exactly the materialist reductionist perspective that is taken by mainstream science today. So consciousness emerges out of matter. Who said that in ancient India? The materialists, the Charvakas, Lokayatikas, they said that. And said, they give a very simple example. They said that just as you eat a pan, and when you chew the pan and the red color emerges, no ingredient of the pan is red, but yet the red color emerges by a mixture of those elements. Similarly, by the mixture of physical elements, awareness or consciousness emerges. This is the objection to that has been ancient, and in modern form it is David Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness. Second alternative is matter emerges from consciousness. Who says this? Actually, all the theistic schools of religion, whether it's Christianity or Islam or Vaishnavism or Shaktaism or Shaivism, all of them, any school of thought which says there is a God who created the universe. Basic principle there is, certainly your God will be a conscious God. So you are saying that a conscious being created the material universe. So matter emerged out of consciousness. That's the second model. The third model is neither emerged out of the other. Both are parallel realities. Matter and consciousness since eternal time have been interacting with each other. Who says that? Sankhya says it. It's a dualism. Today, David Chalmers says it, panpsychism. The third approach is, the fourth approach is the Advaitic approach, which says matter is an appearance in consciousness, not that matter emerged out of consciousness. There is no such thing as a separate material universe apart from consciousness. It is consciousness itself which appears as the material order of the universe. Or like Swami Vivekananda put it, he said, one alone exists. It appears as nature and soul, the subject and the object. So that one alone which exists is consciousness itself, is the, as Advaita Vedanta would put it, ekam eva advitiyam, one without a second. That which appears to be a second, that which appears to be an object, is an appearance in consciousness, not different from consciousness. And this, why consciousness appears as its objects, how does it appear as its own objects? This is called the inherent power of consciousness. We call it Maya. Okay, summing up. So what did we get so far, and which might be useful going ahead? First, consciousness is most important. This, I mean, more and more there is acceptance of this on all sides, that this is very central to our existence as human beings. Consciousness is a very central thing, most central. Second, and this is something that Vedanta, Sankhya can contribute to modern philosophy of mind, is that consciousness is not an object. This is not clearly understood. It clears up many problems in modern philosophy of mind. I remember many of the papers which we read in Harvard, the conclusions are so confused that this one principle can clarify that consciousness is not an object, mind is an object. So in consciousness studies today, if you ask, please give an example of what you are studying, what will we say? We'll say, oh, we are studying memory, we are studying pain, we are studying thinking processes. From an Advaitic or Sankhyan perspective, what is going on? So you are studying a mixture of two things. You're studying consciousness plus some objective processes which belong to the mind. These two are mixed together, and you are calling, I'm studying, that is what I'm studying. But you must separate, at least conceptually separate, awareness and the processes in the mind. Memory is a process in the mind. Pain is a process in the body and mind. Creativity is a process in the mind. Emotions are a process in the mind. Perceptions are the process in the senses and in the mind. They're all lit up, revealed, illumined, whatever you call it, sakshi, by consciousness. This conceptual difference is, I think, very important. I don't know what bearing it will have for the neuroscience, but definitely it has a huge bearing for philosophy of mind today. This conceptual difference is not understood between consciousness and mind. The third important um, um, takeaway from all of this is consciousness one or many? It seems to be many, but the Vedantic understanding is that it's one. And the final takeaway from all of this would be, it's very radical. What is the relationship between consciousness and object, between awareness and material universe? According to Vedanta, it's actually a monistic relationship. That means it is one reality. What we think to be matter is actually nothing other than consciousness, but it appears as an object to consciousness. This is not as crazy, you know. It's not something that ancient people thought and not at all acceptable to modern thought, but it's not true. This Galen Strawson, who is a philosopher in the University of Texas, I think he might have retired. He wrote this sort of half humorous piece, but half serious, in the New York Times a few years back. He called it the hard problem of matter. He said there is actually no hard problem of consciousness. Why? You have already made up your mind that consciousness is nothing but brain. Step 2, you cannot reduce consciousness to brain. Step 3, therefore, hard problem of consciousness. Consciousness must be brain, but I can't see how consciousness is brain, therefore hard problem. Rather, he says, start from the other end. This is so Sankhya or Advaitic. He says, start from the other end. Start from the fact that I am conscious. That's the basis. That's the beginning of all our experience, that I am conscious. Then matter appears to me in my consciousness. See, the entire world appears to me in my consciousness. All material reality and mental reality appears to me in my consciousness. So he says that it's rather a hard problem of matter. What is matter is the problem. And he says, if you look at modern physics, matter is continually vanishing before our eyes. From atoms to subatomic particles to quarks to superstrings, we are unable to find the bottom of this well. What exactly is matter? That is eluding us. So, okay, we started off with the problem of consciousness and we have ended up with the problem of matter. Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. So we can discuss it now.
Swamiji, we can discuss it now. Thank you, Swamiji, for such a wonderful, lucid and exposition on different aspects of how to approach consciousness from the philosophical aspects. So probably I think we'll get some insights that how to actually, from neuroscience perspective, where do we stand? My personal opinion is that probably we, if you look at the journey of consciousness studies from the Indian philosophical perspectives from thousands of years, in the present neuroscience perspective, probably I think we fit in very clearly for the Charvakas, rather than getting into Advaitic. So I think it's a very long journey where neuroscience of Charvakas will get into the Advaita or Advaitic aspects from the neuroscience perspective. Now I open this thing for the discussion, and so there are a couple of questions in the chat box. So I would like to read out the first question is, what is collective consciousness and how does collective consciousness arise?
Right. Before I go on, I just Googled it. The name of the physicist, string theorist, whose name I couldn't recall, Ed Witten. And if you Google it on YouTube, you'll find there's an interview with Ed Witten. If you Google Ed Witten consciousness, so there he makes that very perceptive observation that by neuroscience over the years, we will understand more and more about brain, and we'll discover many things, but we will not be able to explain. I don't think, he says, we'll be able to explain how those processes, or if at all those processes, are giving rise to consciousness. So it's a very interesting interview. Now, collective consciousness, how does it arise? You can see from the Advaitic perspective, there cannot be any collective consciousness. If consciousness is one, so one reality shining in and through several minds. Now, what we normally might call connective consciousness is these minds, which are many in number. So if they think, or if they conceive of something in unison, that will appear to be a collective consciousness. That can happen because minds are always interacting. We are interacting directly, we are interacting through culture, we are interacting through the media. In fact, I think it was David Chalmers, in one of the readings that we did in the philosophy of mind, he was talking about the extended self. So he was saying that why should we, it is just sort of an idea which is just the opposite of Sankhya or Advaita. In Sankhya and Advaita, you see, we are stepping back from the body to the mind to consciousness. But he's saying, why step back like that? Go forward. So I am conscious, my mind is also I, body is also I, plus extended self. That means my phone is also I, because a lot of my data, my ideas are stored there. My computer, my cloud storage, all our devices is also me, because it is an extension of my individual existence. So he's calling it an extended self. But in that sense, an extended self already exists as what you are just calling the collective consciousness. One thing I'll just say here, notice if we take the Sankhyan or the Advaitic perspective, our terminology will have to change. So thing like collective consciousness does not exist. Collective mind, yes, it does exist. But collective consciousness will not exist, because consciousness is one, or in Sankhya, consciousness may be many, but it is not connected to the mind. It cannot be clustered together or put together into a collection. So that's one point we'll have to keep in mind. For example, when we speak about, it's casually speak about transformation of consciousness, growth of consciousness, all this terminology will have to be dumped or changed, because from an Advaitic or Sankhyan perspective, consciousness cannot be transformed. Consciousness does not grow. It is the body which is transformed. It is the brain may be transformed. It is the mind which is transformed. A mind may grow and develop, and does grow and develop. But consciousness itself, because it's the nature of a continuous, unchanging luminosity, it cannot change. Let me give you a logical argument. Why can consciousness not change? Because if it does change, will you know it or will you not know it? If you are aware of the change in consciousness, anything that you are aware of is an object. So that change will be an object. And the consciousness is not an object. So the change will be in something objective, probably in the mind. So it's not consciousness which has changed. Suppose you say, no, let consciousness change and we do not know about it. Then why talk about it? If it's in principle, it cannot be known at all, then you need not talk about it at all. So logically speaking, consciousness cannot change. If it cannot change, it cannot develop, it cannot transform, it cannot be born, it cannot die. All that follows.
So in this direction, I think we need some more clarity. Person has asked, if consciousness is neither the subject nor the object, then what it is? Where does it lead?
Right. Consciousness not subject nor object. Consciousness, the first step was consciousness is not the object. It is that which is aware of the object. So it is actually the subject. The ultimate conclusion of Advaita Vedanta, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jiva Brahmeva Napara. If you transform it into our present language, consciousness is reality, and the object is an appearance in that reality, and the subject is nothing but that consciousness. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jiva Brahmeva Napara. Now, you might put it very simply. What is the proof of this consciousness? If that this such a thing exists, what is the proof? And here is a simple answer, but a very powerful answer, that everything appears to it. The fact that you are having experiences, Shankaracharya puts it this way: consciousness is the very self of the one who denies consciousness. Yaeva tasya nirakarta tasyaiva atmasa. Whoever denies the existence of consciousness, who says that, oh, there is no such thing, that very one is consciousness. The fact that you are having experiences, so it's like asking, what is the proof that I've got eyes? What is the proof that these things exist? I see them, but I cannot see my eyes. Then what is the proof that I've got eyes? The very fact that I'm seeing it is the proof that I've got eyes. Let me make it even more clear. Here are the glasses, and What is the proof that these glasses are there? I am seeing it. So seeing is a proof of the glasses, but I cannot see my own eyes directly. So there is no proof that I have eyes. No, the proof that I have eyes, if you ask the question, seeing what is the proof that you have got eyes? You cannot see the eyes directly. The answer will be seeing anything is the proof that I have got eyes. So any kind of conscious experience, any kind of first person experience is the proof that you are conscious.
So in that case, the another question continues. Then what is a subconscious state? And then when we are totally unconscious and we are unaware of what we are doing, so how does Vedic and Upanishadic explain this particular state?
Right, there are two questions. What is subconscious state and what is unconscious? So subconscious, again, we'll have to transform our terminology here. The clear answer will be subconscious. Here we'll have to use the term sub-mind. So mind and body both are objects which consciousness is aware of. You are aware of the mind, you are aware of the body. Some aspect of the mind you may not be aware of. So let's call that sub-mind. That is what basically is called unconscious or subconscious in Freudian psychoanalysis. So yeah, so that's the answer to subconscious. You will call it sub-mind. That part of the mind, that part of our tendencies or vasanas which we are not directly aware of. The second thing is, what about unconscious states? What about, deep sleep, coma? How would the Upanishad explain that? Because Upanishad seems to say, Vedanta, Sankhya, they all seem to say consciousness is constant. It does not come and go. Here is a subtle point to understand. In fact, these states, the so-called states of unconsciousness, are not states of unconsciousness. They are states of the non-functioning of the mind, which is why it appears to be blank. And that blankness is revealed by consciousness. Let me rephrase it. Deep sleep, coma, anesthesia, these are not states of the absence of consciousness. These are states where these are states of consciousness of absence. I'll repeat it. It's not absence of consciousness, but consciousness of absence. I remember there was this interesting seminar on consciousness studies. I think Dr. Ravindra himself was present, maybe in that seminar in the Institute of Culture in Golpark several years back, about 20 years back, I think, where one of the professors, he was a neuroscientist from England, and there was a Sankhyan professor, a professor of Sankhya, Indian philosophy, an American professor, Professor Larson, who just passed away a couple of years ago. So Professor Larson and this neuroscientist, so the Professor Larson asked the neuroscientist, what is your definition of, is there consciousness in deep sleep? Yes. Is there consciousness in deep sleep? Now, at the state of the art at that time, the neuroscientist said, in general, I would like to say that in deep sleep, there is no consciousness. Then Professor Larson said, see, here is the difference between Sankhya or Indian philosophy and modern neuroscience. In Sankhya, we would say, in deep sleep, there is only consciousness. I'll repeat that. The neuroscientist said, as far as we define and understand it, in deep sleep, there is no consciousness. And the Sankhyan says that in deep sleep, there is only consciousness. This is the difference between a third person perspective and a first person perspective. Is there a first person perspective in deep sleep? It would seem no. But the first person perspective in deep sleep actually is there, and it's a perspective that it's blank. There is nothing. There is no external world. There is no body. There is no sensory experience. There is no mind functioning also. Even the thought that I am sleeping is not there. If you have the thought that I'm sleeping, then you're not sleeping. So even the mind is shut down. This uniform shutdown state of body and mind and sensory apparatus all shut down. It's like when you are watching a movie and then the movie is finished. Before the lights come on in the cinema hall, it's a uniform darkness. So you were aware of the sights and sounds of the movie. Now you are aware of blankness, darkness, silence, but you are aware. So that it's something like that in deep sleep. In deep sleep, anesthesia, there is no memory, there is no thinking as such, there is no intellect which will understand such a thing is going on. All these are parts of the mind, and they kick in, they start when the mind awakes again. One proof of this would be the very fact, and Vedanta talks about it, they study this deep sleep state quite well, and they talk about it, that notice that when we wake up, we refer to a deep sleep state. We said, I slept happily, I had dreams, and then there was a state, there was nothing, there was no dreams. I knew nothing, I slept happily. Na kinchid avedisham. I did not know anything, which is directly consciousness illumining the state of blankness.
Yeah.
So consciousness revealing the blankness, the non-functioning of the mind, that is deep sleep state. That is also anesthesia or coma. Consciousness continues there. And I would also say, notice, deep sleep is something that is referred to in every culture of the world. In every culture of the world, there is a reference to the experience of deep sleep. If it is an experience, there must be consciousness there. How would you define experience in Sankhya or Vedanta? Very neat definitions are there. What is experience? Consciousness plus object is equal to experience. Awareness or consciousness with an object of awareness, that gives rise to experience. If there is no object, then consciousness will reveal the absence of the object. That is deep sleep.
When Christoph Koch or David Chalmers talk about consciousness, they refer to experience itself, whereas according to Vedantic perspective, experience and consciousness are different. Please clarify, Swamiji.
Very nice question. Yes, you are right. So these insights are not yet very clear, I think, in modern philosophers of mind. As I said earlier, even now the difference between mind and consciousness has not been appreciated. It leads to endless confusions. So experience, as I said, is consciousness plus an object. It could be consciousness plus a thought, consciousness plus a memory, consciousness plus a sensation. Then you have an experience. A first person experience requires consciousness plus an object of consciousness. That's why when the object is not there, in anesthesia, in deep sleep, in coma, it may feel to that person, first person, like nothing, blank. So yes, even David Chalmers, Christoph Koch and all, they talk about, especially David Chalmers talks about consciousness as the first person experience. In that, consciousness plus object of experience are already present. Yeah, and this distinction, it needs to be made. And then we can understand better. Now suppose, one more thing. As I said, neat definitions are there. How is experience defined? Consciousness plus object. How will you define consciousness? You see, this is a big problem in consciousness studies. And yet there is a very neat definition available. In this way of thinking, the Sankhya or Advaitic way of thinking, consciousness can be neatly defined. Anidam Chaitanyam, not this consciousness. So whatever is an object is not consciousness. It's an object to consciousness. The neat definition of consciousness is anidam, not this.
So in the extension of one more question for the further extension of your answers, Swamiji, what you gave. From both these, from philosophical insight, if you want to offer us an operational definition at this point of time, at this moment, for us to approach consciousness from neuroscience, this one. So what will be your operational definition for us?
This definition which I just gave is a fantastic operational definition. Operation definition points out in practice what we are referring to. You sort of delineate it from everything else. So this is a definition which you can develop from the Drigdrishya Viveka, from the Sankhyan perspective. You don't have to go to Advaitic perspective. So not this. Look at your experience. Which experience? Any experience. And then apply this category of not this, or this knife, this definition of not this. In your experience, whatever you can classify as this is not consciousness. That which is aware is consciousness. I'll repeat. Whatever you can classify in your experience right now as this object, it's not consciousness. That which is aware of this is consciousness. Now, notice the procedure we followed in Drigdrishya Vivek. This form, That's not consciousness. The one which is aware of it is consciousness through the eyes. These eyes, this. So therefore not consciousness. That which is aware of the eyes is consciousness. Apply it again. What is aware of the eyes? Mind. This mind, thoughts, feelings, emotions. Can you say this thought, this idea, this emotion? Yes. Then that is not consciousness. That which is aware of this thought, feeling, emotion is consciousness. To that one, can you say this consciousness? You cannot. You come up against a hard stop there that you can point towards it, but you cannot say this consciousness. You can never make it an object. This unobjectifiable yet undeniable reality is consciousness. It is a little difficult because we don't think in that way. Our whole thinking, by very understandable reasons, is a very objective way of thinking. So we try to, our tendency is always to objectify. That's why the Sankhya Purusha or Advaitic Atma seems very elusive. That's why someone as smart as David Hume said, I don't find any evidence of self. Not only David Hume, I was just listening to Susan Blackmore, who's a consciousness researcher in England, I think. She was saying, I have meditated for 20 years. She's a consciousness researcher. So I've meditated for 20 years. And I have not found any evidence of the self. So it's an illusion created. Vidyaranya Swami would say that illusion to whom? You are saying, I have not found any evidence. What is that which has not found any evidence? There's a direct verse in Panchadashi which says that consciousness is not found. The self, which is consciousness, is not found, not because it does not exist, which is what David Hume or Susan Blackmore today thinks. It does not exist. Not because it does not exist. It's because you're looking in the wrong place. It's because it's not an object. The very fact that there can be an entirely different order of reality called the subject, that people are not willing to accept so far. This is the thing.
So then when you said that which the entity which will be aware of something, when you say it's consciousness, then when the participant is asking, then how to distinguish the Sakshi Bhav from an experience?
Sakshi Bhav from an experience. An experience is what? Sakshi plus an object. Sakshi shining an object. Light shining in an object is an illumined object. Illumined object is what I'm calling experience. Now, of course, this physical light is also an object because I'm aware of it. Mind is also an object because I'm aware of it. Consciousness plus its object is called an experience. The Sakshi plus its object is called an experience. In every experience, again, this Drigdrishya Viveka does a wonderful job of it. In fact, the entire practice is this question: how do I distinguish the Sakshi in an experience? In every experience, what is experience? Sakshi plus object. Now what you do is take up an object. It could be a thought, any thought, and become aware of awareness. That is, I'm aware of being aware. I'm aware of this object. This awareness is awareness of awareness. But remember, this awareness of awareness is not an objective awareness. The moment you become aware of it, you are it. That is the only way you can express it. Sri Ramakrishna used to call it bodhe bodhkara. Becoming, bodha means awareness. So becoming aware of awareness. That's the only way you can point out. But again, it need not be confusing. All you have to do is simply try it. And all these procedures are there. I give one procedure, Drigdrishya Viveka. There are other procedures. Another is called Panchakosha Viveka. Another is called Avasthatraya Vichara. All of these are procedures to eliminate the this and to isolate the Sakshi in yourself. Isolate in the sense, I am that Sakshi. That should become very clear. So notice what you do. You just relax, sit quietly, take up an object, maybe a flower. Become aware of the flower, then become aware of that eyes are seeing the flower. Your awareness, your attention is now transferred to the eyes. Close your eyes and open it once. My eyes are closed, my eyes are open. The mind noticed the opening and closing of the eyes. Transfer your awareness to the mind itself. Notice thoughts, emotions, sensations are coming and going in the mind. I'm aware of the thoughts, emotions, and sensations, memories in the mind. What is that awareness? You will never be able to objectify it. Anything that you objectify will be mind or sensation or external world. That unobjectifiable yet undeniable awareness is consciousness, is Sakshi, is you, or is I. This is the meaning of Aham Brahmasmi. This is up to Sankhya. Then further you will go that Aham Brahmasmi means Advaita. So then what is the relationship between the Sakshi and the object? The object has to be reduced back to the Sakshi. That is the Advaitic process. That will one more step forward or one more step back.
So in that case, Sankhya says mind is a very subtle matter.
So, both mind is central, but central to what? Central to experience. It is our experience is mediated through the mind. If you have the mind, you will have a variety of experiences. If you don't have the mind, you will have only the experience of absence. So central thing is consciousness. With consciousness, experience is possible. It requires an object. Object can be our very colorful experience of the world. You see, hear, smell, taste, all of that depends on the presence of the mind and the presence, deployment of instruments of knowledge. These epistemological instruments, the sense organs. So with the mind plus sense organs will give the Sakshi the experience of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. And mind itself will give you the experience of thinking, remembering, desiring, understanding, forgetting, happy, sad. All of that is in the mind. You shut it all down, no senses, then there will be no sensory experiences, like a sensory deprivation tank. And no mind, then there will be no experience at all, just blank. You can call it an experience of blankness. So central is always consciousness. The next in importance is mind. Next in importance is the sensory system. So
in that case, the next question comes, can we equate mind is the emergent things that comes from the brain?
Can we equate mind and brain? The interesting thing is that from an Advaitic perspective, no, why just Advaitic? All Indian philosophies will have no objection in relating mind and brain. Why not? Immediately you can say, why not? Because brain is obviously an object. And from an Advaitic or Sankhyan perspective, even mind is an object because you are aware of the contents of the mind. Two objects can be related. See, this was my objection to Massimo's example of life or Ned Block's example of life, that we could not understand life earlier and people used to say science will never be able to explain life. Now we have been able to explain life in terms of down to the molecular level, cellular, even intracellular level, down to the molecular level, we can explain the processes called life. Similarly, one day we will explain processes of consciousness in terms of brain processes. Immediately from an Advaitic perspective, the objection would be life is an object. Brain is matter is an object. I mean, your molecules. So if you're explaining life in terms of molecular action in cells, good. We have no objection in principle. It's fine. One higher level objective process is explained in terms of more fundamental level of objective processes. It can entirely be done. It's in principle, there's no problem. Similarly, from an Advaitic perspective, mind is also an object, a series of objective processes. If you think you can relate mind to brain, fine. Brain is an object and mind is an object. So you can reduce mind, you can relate mind to brain. Then Advaita Vedanta or Sankhya or any of these philosophies will not have any problem with it. One point here, how does Advaita or Sankhya or many of these philosophies, what do they think of mind and brain? They don't talk about brain. They did not have this understanding of modern understanding of neuroscience in those days. But mind and body, how do they talk about it? Here we have to go to Sankhyan cosmology. Body, they talk about gross matter, or in Sanskrit, sthula, physical matter, more or less as we understand physical matter. But mind, they call a special kind of matter, they call it sukshma or tanmatra. This subtle matter, if you ask today in modern physics, what would be this subtle matter? This gross matter is clear. Physics, what we call matter is, they would agree that is matter. But sukshma, the tanmatra, what is that which constitutes the mind? I don't know how you will map sukshma tanmatra into modern cosmology or modern particle physics. I don't think there is anything cognate yet. But in principle, there is no problem. Mind is relatable to the brain. But why am I drawing this distinction? Because since the mind is supposed to be subtle matter, tanmatras, so from a Sankhyan, Vedantic, Buddhist, Jain perspective, when the physical body and the brain nervous system, when they die, it is not that the mind will die with it. So the subtle matter still exists. The whole idea of transmigration, it goes on. It's more like a good simple example would be hardware and software. So all if your laptop dies or your phone does not work anymore, your data is not lost. It is backed up to the cloud. The moment you buy another laptop or phone, you can download your data into it and you can continue. Something like that. The mind will be something a little bit like software, like data, which even when the physical hardware, the body fails and dies, it still continues in newer bodies. So this is the whole idea of reincarnation and all. And in principle, this should be available for scientific investigation. Maybe not at this point in modern physics, but in future, it should be available. Why it should be available? Because these are objective processes. Even Sankhya admits it's an objective process. If it's an objective process, it should be possible to study it objectively.
So, when you say, Swamiji, that the mind can be correlated to the brain processes, one is a gross matter and another is a very subtle matter.
Yes.
Then the next question comes, then what actually David Chalmers means the heart problem of consciousness? Or is it a heart problem of mind rather than heart problem of consciousness?
Right. So notice that David Chalmers has I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say he has not understood this difference, but he does not talk about this difference
from philosophical perspective.
From philosophical perspective, he noticed that he does not make a difference between mind and consciousness. So mind is reducible to matter. For him, no, it cannot be reduced to matter. That is the hard problem of consciousness from a David Chalmers perspective. The David Chalmers perspective of hard problem of consciousness is mind and consciousness, he is using it interchangeably. Like all these consciousness studies people right now, I mean, in philosophy of mind people. That's why I'm saying this is something that Indian philosophy can contribute. New insight it can contribute, which is very useful for modern consciousness studies. But right now, they do not distinguish between mind and consciousness. It is these thoughts, feelings, emotions, ideas, they are all first-person experiences. That is consciousness, that is mind, and it's the more or less in the same continuum. And this cannot be reduced to the brain. This is what he is trying to say.
So there's one last question from one of the participants, and he is asking, how does a deep sleep differs from Sushupti during meditation?
Sushupti or deep sleep and Sushupti are the same thing. How does it differ from meditation?
During meditation.
Yeah. So meditation, the deepest states of meditation, which are called samadhi, are in some sense similar to deep sleep, but the difference would be like this. In deep sleep, we lose all awareness altogether of, the mind shuts down completely. So we are asleep in deep sleep. That is the definition. But in samadhi, it would be like that we are in deep sleep, not aware of the body, not aware of the world, not aware of the body, not even aware of the mind. There's no mind body functioning. I mean, or not, you're not aware of it. And yet you have not fallen asleep. No thinking is going on. So when you come out of deep sleep, you still feel you awake into this waking life. You're still the same person. But when you come out of samadhi, the mind can actually look back upon that and see that, oh, I existed as awareness itself, even without the mind. So this difference between consciousness and the entire material order up to mind, that you are different from it, this becomes clear. So this is yogic samadhi, Patanjali Yoga Samadhi, Asampragyata Samadhi. So when you come out of it, Yoga Sutra says, Tada drashtu swarupe avasthanam. In the highest samadhi, there the witness consciousness remains in its own nature. At other times, it says vritti sarupyam itaratra. That is the fourth sutra. In other times, when the mind is functioning and the senses are functioning, consciousness is mixed up with the functionings of the mind and sense. And you're getting experiences. I am seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, talking, thinking. This is mixing up with the activities of objective activities of mind and body. Objective activities of mind and body are shut down, yet I am awareness itself. This distinction becomes clear, but only after the mind starts functioning, then you will understand what went on in samadhi. So you get an appreciation that yes, I am actually consciousness. I'm not, and this mind and the physical body and sensory system are like layers which have been put on me.
Swamiji, then can we equate Turiya state to that consciousness?
Yes, absolutely. And note, to be precise, Turiya is not a state. So from the, I did not go into that procedure. And right now what I did was Drigdrishya Viveka. But the same type we can do, same kind of analysis we can do in waking, dreaming, deep sleep. That is called Avasthatraya Vichara. In fact, Evan Thompson's book is named for that, Waking, Dreaming, Being. He calls it Waking, Dreaming, Being. So waking, dreaming, deep sleep, the Mandukya Upanishad says there is a fourth called Turiya. Waking first, dreaming second, deep sleep third, and Turiya, which is consciousness, the fourth. But then Shankaracharya makes it clear, Maya Sankhya Turiyam. What he says is, it is only a false counting. 1, 2, 3 is false counting. Turiya is the only reality which appears as 3 states: waking, dreaming, deep sleep. Waking, dreaming, deep sleep are states of mind. They are not states of consciousness. Consciousness of Turiya is the so-called fourth, which is actually the one which is watching the play of these 3 states. See, a state is something that comes and goes. State, it's something that comes and goes. Consciousness is not something that comes and goes. So in every state, it is the same consciousness which is illumining all of them. In the waking state, it gets identified with the mind and this physical body and experiences the physical universe. In the waking state, in a dream state, the same consciousness shines upon the projected dream universe of the mind. And in deep sleep state, the same consciousness shines upon the blankness, the non-functioning of the mind. This is waking, dreaming, deep sleep, 3 states coming and going, all related to the mind. Consciousness of Turiya is one reality.
Thank you, Swamiji. Thank you for that illuminating talk and very nice discussions that we had.
So I think, okay, we are almost 8:15 now. I think it's a time. I know when we start discussing, it will be endless and we don't feel the passing of time with all this very interesting discussion. So we were very honored, Swamiji, to have you as a keynote in our webinar. I think your whole talk has given a different perspective to try to understand, at least from the conceptual point of view, the difference between mind, consciousness, and how can we relate, say, mind with brain. So because these are some of the people, say, from the spiritual perspective, they ask, so then how do you really can relate the mind with the brain activities, at least, say, from the neuroscience perspective? These are the questions actually that we generally face from non-neuroscience the people. So I think your overall the talk has given us a very, very deeper insights from the conceptual point of view to try to understand and to distinguish very clearly between mind and consciousness and how we can really address this problem with the mind and consciousness. But however, the big question that comes, are we really assessing the mind, or we really understand the consciousness is what actually I think from our perspective, we have to go deep into thinking, and we have to figure it out what actually. So on behalf of Center for Consciousness, Swamiji, I thank you very much for such a wonderful and illuminating deep insights and thoughts that you have given us. So I hope that in future also we will be having such a wonderful interaction, and your insights will be definitely very helpful for our Center for Consciousness Studies, where one of the objectives is to integrate the neuroscience with the Indian philosophical thought system. So maybe in days to come, definitely we can have a good insights from you and how to go about in the future. So thank you very much, Swamiji. And I also
thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I must say that the questions were excellent.
And I thank all the participants. I hope, I'm very sure that all the participants would have been experienced a very high learning experience throughout the day today. And I thank all the participants. And so we'll be starting, and tomorrow is our last day of the webinar. And tomorrow we are starting with one more wonderful keynote. Tomorrow at 9:30 with Dr. Mani Bhavik, who is speaking on how quantum physics can, does that explain something on the neurophysiological aspects, but how it can influence the healing. So we'll meet tomorrow at 9:30 for Mani Bhavik's keynote. Thank you, Swamiji. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care. Stay safe.